Welcome back to the Men's Journal Everyday Warrior. I'm your host, Mike Sorelli. I am joined by Michael Vickers, who technically was my boss while in special operations. Basically, this guy makes Jack Ryan look like child's play, and I'm sure he'll smile at that. He started off with a career coming from California as well in the Army Special Forces onto the CIA and was eventually the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Prior to that, he was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for SOLIC, which for those listening is Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. Mike, thanks for joining us today, and congrats on the day your book has just come out.
Thanks. Pleasure to be with you, Mike.
So, I've got to ask, you've had a lot of time probably to reflect not only on your career, but the global war on terror. Watching it end like the rest of us did, didn't end well. But it seems like everyone focused on that singular event, regardless of how tragic it was. Do you think we've done a good job of sort of memorializing all the lessons learned on a national scale?
Well, I hope so. One of the mistakes we made after Vietnam was to think we would never do irregular warfare again, certainly on that scale. And then after 9/11, when we had Iraq and Afghanistan, we had to relearn a lot of lessons. So I hope in counterterrorism, we've developed enormous capabilities. I hope we learn the lessons because there are several very important ones. One, we were in a global fight, and a critical principle we didn't apply before 9/11, but we did after, was to deny our adversaries any sanctuary. And then the ways and means we went about those dismantling and defeating those adversaries differed by theater. In some cases, we used partner forces. Some cases, we used special operations raid, real high tempo of raids to go after them. Other cases, we used predator strikes and used allies to disrupt. And so it depended on the theater what was the appropriate instrument. You need all of them, and you need to keep forces in a high degree of readiness. I hope we just don't turn our back on this because we have them down now, but not out.
I don't think we'll ever have them completely out, and
Yeah.
that's the continual fight. I will say this: from a young SEAL officer to I got out as a mid-grade officer, a lieutenant commander from the JSOC community. It was impressive to watch how the U.S. government and the U.S. military sped up to the let's just say the speed of war and to the magnitude.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because as before 9/11, we had very sophisticated forces to do an operation, but not necessarily to do a campaign, which was what was required, with this very well, the find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze cycle that turned operations into campaigns. That's what really helped us dismantle these groups.
Well, Mike, you've got a very interesting career as we opened up. I'd love to go back to the beginning. You lived in basically Hollywood, California, if
Yep.
that's correct.
Went to Hollywood High School. Yep.
I did read in your bio that you were beaten out for the starting quarterback position by Mark Harmon. I'm sure you still hold some regrets there.
That was at a community college after high school, but wasn't even close. So he wouldn't even remember me.
So you quickly joined the U.S. Army Special Forces. What drove you in that direction? Because it doesn't sound like you came from a huge military lineage within your family.
Yeah, my father had served as a B-17 bombardier and door gunner in bombing missions over Germany in World War II. But that's right. I didn't really come from a military family, and early on, I'd hoped to be an athlete, and those dreams faded pretty fast. And so I thought I wanted a life of adventure where make a contribution to our country and where individuals could really make a difference. And so I thought about both CIA and at the time the Green Berets, the Special Forces. Our community wasn't quite as developed as it was today, and found out I could enlist directly into the Special Forces. The hard part would then be, passing the qualification course, but I managed to do that as well, and then went from enlisted to officer.
It's always interesting to hear what forced or drove guys to join the military. Was it one specific movie, Was it the John Wayne Green Berets, or did
Well,
you actually meet a
I
Green
like,
Beret?
yeah, I liked that, and I talked to people who knew Green Berets. I mean, from ROTC or something. It was very, very second or third hand information. Um, but I actually had a high school teacher my senior year who put a copy of the New York Times down in front of me, and it was a big story about a CIA base in Laos where they were running a secret war as part of the Vietnam War, supporting Hmong tribesmen. And he said, "You might be interested in this." And I thought, hey, running secret armies might be pretty cool. So yeah, I think I am interested. So that's what started it.
Well, good. It sounds like you knew what you wanted to do from a young age. What you know, I actually started out in the Marine Corps, and I do give the Marine Corps a lot of credit for laying the foundation beyond my parents to, for the remainder of my success. Was a transition from special forces into the intelligence community, namely the CIA. Was that an easy transition? Did a lot of things sort of segue over?
Um, yes, pretty much. I mean, um, where I ended up serving in the CIA, invasion of Grenada, response to the Beirut bombings of our Marine barracks in '83 and embassy before that, and then Afghanistan covert action program, all were special operations or paramilitary activities,
Yes.
paramilitary covert action, as CIA talks about. So it was a reasonably good transition, a little further afield, but I was on the operational side of CIA. It would have been a different transition if I were an analyst or something else, something I hadn't done. But, preparing for World War III with the 10th Special Forces Group, if it came in Europe, helped prepare me for the secret war in Afghanistan, kind of the Cold War that we fought, under covert means.
So, I've got to ask. I think the program is declassified. If it's not, we'll strike this. But did I read you were part of the teams that were prepared to jump in a small tactical nuke?
Yes, part of that is declassified now. The weapons went out of the inventory with the end of the Cold War, and yeah, a group of special forces, Green Berets and SEALs, were trained to jump those things, either free fall or static line, and then use them to try to block the second echelon forces. To halt a Soviet advance on Eastern Europe because they outnumbered us, pretty substantially, and so I got that training early on. When I was 23, it sounded like a really good idea. I'm not sure it does so
I,
much
I,
anymore.
you know what? There's a lot of things that sound cool at 23. Nowadays, I'd say, wait. You want us to jump in a small tactical nuke
Right.
and then detonate it probably on a delay. I mean, that sounds like a suicide mission,
Yeah.
but I understand the intent.
Yeah, that's how a lot of my teammates saw it, and probably true. And I'll tell you a funny story. Many decades, several decades later, I was getting a briefing by some of the national lab designers of the weapon, and they knew, and they were briefing me on something else about foreign nuclear weapons, or something that one country had, and they knew about our apprehensions about a timer. Once you touch that device, if you managed to get it in place and you had all the codes and everything else, that would be it. That's success. And so they showed a picture of the device at the beginning of the briefing, and they said, this might remind you of your past, and we just want to tell you, we never got that timer to work properly. So got a good chuckle out of it.
Yeah, but I'm sure the government's like, hey, we'll pay you guys an extra $500 a month to be on this team.
There you go.
And again, at
Right.
23, you're like, sold. I need
Yeah.
money.
There you go.
So, for a lot of the audience, you were involved in the Soviet-Afghan war and arming the resistance, popularized by Charlie Wilson's war, in which you were mentioned. That is insane. It seems like you were a part of so many historic things, as you said, from Beirut to Grenada, but to be involved in that program, that must have been an eye opener.
Oh,
And go ahead.
yeah, it was. I describe it as the job of a lifetime, to really fight our direct enemy, where they had made themselves vulnerable. And at a time when, the Congress and the US government were really aligned behind it. And so resources were plentiful. And I thought, this is just this is the job of a lifetime. It might, might turn out to be a history making event.
What did you learn and respect about the Taliban at that time and the other forces classified under resistance? I mean, did you have a level of respect for
Um,
them?
so it wasn't the Taliban then. The Taliban really came, after the Cold War was over. That means, students, and they were the younger fighters in a part of the country, in the southern part of Afghanistan.
Mhm,
The
mhm,
big part of the Pashtun belt, as you know well. And so the Afghan resistance was made up of seven major groups. Four of them Islamist to one degree or another, but different ethnic groups: Tajiks in some cases, Pashtuns and others, and then and degrees of fundamentalism or Islamism, and then three more secular groups who either supported the return of the king or
mhm,
were just more secular in general, and um, and so yes, the Afghan people, don't unite on much, but they do unite on expelling a foreign invader. And they were brave fighters, and they had all the conditions needed for a successful resistance. They had a sanctuary, they had external sponsors in the United States and lots of other countries, but they had great terrain in Afghanistan, to do ambushes and have base areas, etc. They had the support of the populace, so they really controlled the countryside and could get into the cities, had good intelligence. But the most important thing is they had the will to fight.
yeah.
When you don't always see that in a resistance movement, and they did. Every Afghan has a gun, and so our task was just to make them as good of fighters as they can through weapons training, intelligence, and all the things we could do to support them.
You just said that they're very good at, or they feel a sense of purpose on expelling foreign fighters from their lands. That's almost a cautionary tale for a prolonged war in Afghanistan, as we saw in the global war on terror. Um, I mean,
Yeah,
were those lessons you tried to sort of convey to the senior leaders?
yeah. So I think the challenge in general is to keep your main objective the main objective. And the reason we went into Afghanistan was to overthrow the regime, eliminate that sanctuary, overthrow the regime that
Mhm,
had attacked us, and therefore, and then start dismantling Al Qaeda and its allies, and to prevent another 9/11. And we kind of, after we toppled them, and then had the Iraq War, we kind of lost our way a little bit about really remaking. That we had to build strong, healthy, democratic societies in the Middle East, and that is beyond our capabilities in
mhm,
certain areas. Um, and you're right, with irregular war, they're inherently protracted, particularly if insurgents have conditions like the Taliban have. They had Pakistan supporting them, so that no matter how many we killed, they could generate more and they could retreat, rest for a while and then come back in and fight. And Afghanistan is good guerrilla country, um, and so as a strategist or as a policymaker and as a military commander, you have to be cognizant of that. That eventually good wars might turn bad on you if you don't make them, if you don't keep focused on your narrow objective, and if you don't have kind of uh, a proportionate commitment. In other words, you want the locals to do as much fighting for you as you can, train and advise them, and then use our special capabilities. But you don't want to substitute. You don't want to push. Every time we push the locals out of the way and do the fighting ourselves, even if we're very successful, it doesn't last.
it's almost teach a man to fish,
Yeah,
feed him for a
there,
lifetime.
there you go.
So, and you were a
And so, the
proponent.
tragedy, let me
Go
just
ahead.
say,
Yes.
the tragedy of Afghanistan is it was costly. It took us a long time. We made mistakes along the road. Basically, we had achieved that by the late decade. And our political leaders of both parties, had kind of given up on it, so, there's a lesson in there for strategists, whether you like it or not. But I believe it was a mistake. I believe having a small force in Afghanistan would have served our interests better going forward than completely withdrawing.
You know, I'm sure with media, the military and senior leaders as yourself take a lot of hits. I know you do publicly for the decisions that are made during the war. And, I feel a sense of responsibility for the outcomes of the war. And watching those 13 young service members perish during the withdrawal. I remember I was on an airplane in tears, just at the fact that some of them were born after 9/11. But,
Right.
war, you've seen human nature in its role in conflict. War is not formulaic like starting a
Right.
business. I mean, what do you say to people that have no experience in this realm that may be overly critical of how things were handled?
Yeah. So I think again, there's this perception. This is somewhat unique to irregular wars where we make a large commitment, but there's this sense that they're local civil wars. We don't have a big interest there, and they're forever. And so the goal is just to end and leave. At some point, if you think you're not winning, and it's a mistake on several fronts. One, some of these things are different in the sense that they're harboring terrorists, global jihadist terrorists who want to attack the United States. It's not a local civil war. And second, you can keep them down, not out, but you can certainly keep them down by um, once you achieve the right conditions by a combination of advisors and some air power, et cetera. And I think we misdiagnosed the situation, and people's perceptions of this is shaped by our political leaders and then the media. Let's face it, that doesn't
Yeah.
mean they're wrong, but I mean, they're not paying tons of attention to this. And so it's incumbent upon our leadership and our military and intelligence and national security leaders to try to convey the right impression and what's at stake.
After the 9/11 attacks, based off intelligence, was there a wide held belief that they were postured to conduct more, um, attacks on American soil?
Yeah, yes. Now uh I have that second hand because I hadn't come back into
Mhm.
government yet as an assistant secretary, but all my colleagues that I subsequently served with and knew before, that was certainly the perception.
So, where I'm going with this is, we kept them at bay for 20 years. We've had no major attacks on US soil since 9/11. And that seems to be sort of glossed over as a victory. To what degree do we need to reshape the American public to understand that, these are fanaticals. They're
Right.
going to
Well, if
stop at
you
nothing.
right, if you that's right. And so, what we've learned unfortunately with 9/11, but also when we have allowed Al Qaeda or ISIS to have a sanctuary for 18 to 24 months for a period. They go to a new area, or we try a strategy that doesn't work, or whatever the cause is, the threat goes up. So you may remember, there were a series of threats right after 9/11, but in 2006, when Al Qaeda reconstituted in the Afghanistan Pakistan border region,
Mhm.
the threat went way up. We had a plot that we disrupted with good intelligence to blow up 10 airliners over the Atlantic Ocean. In 9/11, 3,000 people or so, would have perished in that attack. And that's where, all the TSA requirements, because it was improvised
Yes.
explosives, not to have the, more than 3 ounces and all that. That's where it comes from. And and so we mostly had internalized that lesson of not letting them have that sanctuary for too long. And you're right, the key metric is not to have another attack like that, not to have another big attack. And so, um, unfortunately, the guys who won at the end of the day in Afghanistan were the Taliban. They provided support for Al Qaeda, but they weren't purely Al Qaeda. They're more of a local group, in their various forms, Haqqanis and others. Um,
Yes.
but it's still a victory for the jihadist movement in that sense that jihadists won, even if they're not part of Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda will claim that victory psychologically We will say we've beaten the, we've really dismantled pretty heavily Al Qaeda and ISIS, and they're not capable of major attacks now. And if we keep them down, they won't be. But you're right; it is a big accomplishment not to have another major attack in 20 years.
You know, having fought at the tactical level, which you've definitely served at, that was we knew that was our job, was to keep them at bay. You know, with let's say isolationism, or people that believe in the U.S. that we shouldn't be abroad. Where do you see the fatal flaws in that? I know, I understand it costs us billions and billions of dollars for forward projection to have troops overseas. But if we were to pull all our troops back and sort of adopt this isolationism tactic, where do you see the flaws in that?
Oh, history isn't very kind to it. Whether you look at it in the rise of great powers in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, um, where we watched, Japan rearmament and German rearmament, and um, didn't do anything about it until they had conquered vast areas of their regions. Um, and then 9/11, same thing of watching the threat but not really dealing with it. Like if we could go back pre 9/11, I'm sure we would use
Mhm.
different operations. The ones that were successful after 9/11, we would have done that before, rather than a couple cruise missile strikes and treating it as a passing terrorism problem. So um, that kind of isolation is dangerous. The thing people like us have to think about is, how does it give rise in the body politic, and how do you counter it? And so there is a danger for foreign policy decision makers in overreaching strategically, trying to
Mhm.
do too much, particularly when it's not in your vital interest, and doing too little. And both cause you great troubles. The one leads you, if you do too much, you inevitably have an isolationist reaction. And if you do too little, you get a war you didn't want.
You'd also mentioned the FATA in Pakistan. Did you so in terms of our foreign partners, and I know you've got the Five Eyes who are close allies, always have been, long-standing relationships. Did you find it difficult to get cooperation from governments like Pakistan and the Gulf Cooperation Council, nations? Did you expect more for them, or did you feel you got the support? We got the support necessary to wage a global war on terror.
Yeah, so it's a critical question. So
Hmm.
one of the things we did on the success side after 9/11 was build a global counterterrorism network that supported by our intelligence and other support, um, that allowed us to disrupt a lot of plots that we couldn't do before 9/11,
Hmm.
whether they were in the Middle East or whether they're Southeast Asia or Europe or etc. Um, these allies play and partners played different roles. Some of them went into combat with us, directly, and did a good job. Um, Others, it was more intelligence and security work, if their country wasn't at war. Pakistan was a real unique case because it was a frontline state. It had its own terrorism problem. Um, but our interests weren't aligned, So on Al Qaeda, they cooperated a fair amount and were important to us. Right after 9/11, as Al Qaeda leaders fled to Pakistan, they helped us arrest a bunch of them, including the number three Khalid Sheikh Mohammed
Hmm.
and others. Um, but they also continued to back the Taliban, who they'd supported in the 90s, and Haqqanis, and they were making war on, first a small presence in Afghanistan, U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and then a larger presence. And so they were supporting our adversary that was killing Americans. And so in the book, I devote a lot of attention to why that was on in the Afghanistan Pakistan theater, separate from our war with Al Qaeda, where they were more cooperative, as I said. And I call them a frenemy. Part friend, part enemy,
Hmm.
very unique circumstance that you just don't see a lot. And the only thing worse than living with them sometimes is living without them. But it's tough living with them when they're killing Americans, even if they're helping you in some other way that's saving American lives.
I felt that on the tactical level, having fought in the Battle of Sadr City,
Yeah,
which we were fighting against Iranian proxy forces.
right,
Then I was with one of the initial groups into back into Iraq for ISIS, and all of a sudden, meeting with the Kurds, they ushered us out and said we have to meet with our other partners, and here come the
right,
Iranians with
right,
their
right,
their green flags on their heads, and it was very let's just say a strange group of emotions
right.
having 2008 to 2014 to see that, but a realization of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and things
Well, and
change.
and now we talk about a strategic competition with China, and new Cold War. As China has risen, China was a big ally of ours in the Cold War. They were it's not number one, certainly number one ordnance supplier against the Afghan resistance. We were allies then. It's the way history works. Often,
I'm going to hold on China because I do want to come back to that, but I want to ask about so when we exited Iraq, we failed to get a status of forces agreement, which didn't allow us to keep a substantial amount of troops or any troops in Iraq. It was almost like for those I talked to the intelligence community, it was like a slow burn that they saw ISIS building up. They knew this was going to happen, but there was little to do until the Iraqi government officially stated or declared. I'm sorry, not declared, but requested our assistance. That had to be aggravating for individuals like you who had been fighting the war at the most strategic levels to see that happen after so many lives were lost in the initial Iraq war.
yeah, no, it's true. By 2010 or so, even earlier than that, the surge had largely worked. The intelligence networks that we built up
Hmm.
and the special operations capacity that you participated in had really made eventually, short work of Al Qaeda in Iraq, later become ISIS, and the Shia militant groups.
Hmm.
And then Iraq's politics. Clausewitz talks about politics and war. The war that was won militarily then got lost because of sectarian politics and stuff after we left,
Hmm.
and there wasn't much we could do about it. But also, our government really wanted out of Iraq. It wanted Iraq to
Yeah.
be a normal country with the war won. And so there was a lot of staring at the problem. ISIS reconstituted in Syria. They fought a
Yes.
covert war in Iraq after 2011 till 2014 when they invaded, but they really had this sanctuary in
Hmm.
Syria, and we gave them that sanctuary. Again, one of the things you just don't want to do against, because ISIS not only wanted to take over chunks of Syria and come back to Iraq, at least in the Sunni areas and all of Iraq, and build its caliphate, it also wanted to strike the US homeland, and so like Al Qaeda, and so we or strike in Europe as well, and we kind of admired the problem a little too long, at least in Syria.
Hmm.
Once the Syrian civil war started, then you have policy options that you don't have when the government is not necessarily a friendly government to us is running the place. And we didn't do much about it for a few years too. So yes, I think it was mostly the result of Iraqi politics, but it was also we let kind of, like Al Qaeda gathering in Afghanistan before 9/11,
Yes.
ISIS was gathering in Syria.
Mike, as you're talking through this, it's I remember a commander looked at me when I was younger in the teams, and he said, "Hey, Mike, patriotism has a shelf life. The American public won't stand for
Yeah.
long wars." But how do you shape things for people to fully understand that this one's not going away? That terrorism will never be again. You crush them one place, they're like it's like a balloon of water. It just surges to another. That it's an ongoing fight, and that our young men and women are going to be sent forward, usually special operations, to conduct these targeted direct action raids from time to time, or drone strikes. And this is probably still going to be a problem in 2040.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at, number one, insurgencies tend to last a fairly long time if they have anything at all like favorable conditions.
Mhm.
So when you think of the global jihadist terrorist groups, they're like a global insurgency on one level. They may operate at a clandestine level, but they're in lots of countries, in lots of regions. So the idea that you can just defeat them, take this theater, then take this theater, kind of island, is not really accurate, because someone's got to own the ground at the end of the day, and there's just too many ungoverned spaces in wide swaths of the world. And so, you even look at a country like Colombia.
Mhm.
They've done a good job the last couple decades in um, defeating the Marxist insurgency. It had been going on since the mid 1960s. After Soviet Union fell and everything else, that insurgency was still going on and had threatened Bogota, around 2000 or so. And so, now, there wasn't a heavy commitment of U.S. troops. It was advisors and assistants. It was a pretty good strategy to combat it. But it was, that assistance to the Colombian government took place over decades. And I think the war with these global jihadist groups is very similar. It's something you must do, or you're taking a risk. And it's not like um, conventional wars. So if you've got this will be over in months, or this will be over in a few years, it almost never will be. And you even look at, we toppled the Taliban regime and kicked out Al Qaeda, and we did it in a few
Mhm.
months. The war didn't end. It was a first successful, fantastic campaign, but it didn't end the war.
You know what, Mike? I do remember again when I was a young and tenure SEAL officer. There was a retired Master Chief, and he looked at me and he's like, "You guys are better than we were." And for a guy who hadn't had much combat yet, who looked up to that Vietnam era, to hear him say that sort of shook my foundation. And I actually say it about the current special operators serving today. They're smarter, they're faster, they're better. And in fact, the funnel is probably more competitive to get into the Special Forces Assessment and Selection course, to get in to BUDS, to MARSOC. Um, Talk to me a little about special operations. I want, especially from your perspective, and I know it's going to be wildly positive, of what you saw from 1974 to the current status of our special operations in their ability to project forward within hours and conduct anywhere from a direct action raid, or to embed with local nationals to engage in foreign internal offense, which again, for the viewers, is basically training our host nation partners to be able to defend themselves. You must, yeah, I mean, you probably, if you were asked in 1975, you probably wouldn't have predicted the amount of capabilities and competencies that the U.S. SOCOM community has today.
Oh, absolutely. And also it's much larger. We drew down the force substantially after Vietnam. So there were only three special forces groups and two SEAL teams, and the late 70s were pretty lean years, and then we had a build up in the 80s, and then a much bigger build up after 9/11, the decade after 9/11. And our special operators did really great things operationally and tactically in Vietnam. Force multipliers, working with large numbers of indigenous troops, doing very dangerous special reconnaissance missions, and where they were hunted the moment they touched down, try to survive for 3 days and collect intelligence and then get out. The Mac V SOG, the
Yes.
folks, and Sante Raiders. I served with a bunch of them, and they knew how to plan a raid. Um, the experience our special opera, I've said before that one of the benefits I had, we didn't have a lot of combat in the 70s and 80s. So I got alerted for the Angolan Civil War, but mostly it was preparing for World War III with things like backpack nuclear weapons and other things. So one advantage of that is that I got tons of training that later served me very well in the CIA. There's no comparison, though, compared to our brothers who came, after 9/11 and had training and went right into combat, and then years of combat. they're orders of magnitude more proficient than we were. There's just no question. And as I said, the force is bigger. There's no other country in the world that has the diversity and capability of our special operations forces, that can do so many different missions and do it well and do it actually, in quantity, not just quality. We like to say we're a small group and elite, but for instance, if you compare our SEALs to other countries, they may have like the equivalent of maybe a squadron or something, and who does a narrow mission. Our SEALs do all kinds of things, and we've got several teams, and so it's a great asset for the United States.
If if I were to ask you again, for the public who knows very little about special operations, despite what they see in the movies, how would you describe your sort of archetype of what a U.S. special operations operator, a Green Beret, Navy SEALs looks like today? Intelligence, you know, emotional intelligence. How would you describe them to the public that just puts a smile on their face?
Yeah, so I think, um, one obviously, um, they have to be physically fit and courageous, and but they also have to be resourceful and think on their feet well and solve problems for which there's not a textbook solution. That, um, and invent things, and so it makes for a heck of a composite individual. And then I would say, if you take it up to the force level, even though we have wonderful operators, they're not all alike. Some are better at, say, unconventional warfare,
Hmm.
sort of a Green Beret mission. Others are better at direct action, and so Green Berets may do that. They don't do it quite as well as say SEALs or Rangers or some of our special mission units. And so it really depends on the special operator you're talking about. But they're all great in their own way, and they have a common traits. And then as a force, it's just extraordinary for the country.
Do you think it's one of the most innovative organizations we have in this land?
I do. I do. Now, again, it's innovation against its mission set, so it's
Hmm.
hard to compare it with, say, cyberspace or
Yeah,
something
of
that's
course.
quite different. But yes, I think it is because inherently, if you're asked to do something as a small group with a big problem, you better be innovative when you're all we're sending someplace, or you're given a mission that is inherently very dangerous. You better have really thought it through and practiced it and everything else. We don't get these easy jobs, and so that necessitates innovation.
Why? First off, why would you want an easy job? Where's the fun
Right?
in that?
Why would you? What's the fun in that? I agree.
Uh, get comfortable with being uncomfortable which was a mantra amongst
There.
all the military as well as all special operations units. And,
Yeah.
and to your point, man, people ask me all the time, and I'm sure you get this, and it's sort of I say a juvenile question: who's better, Green Berets, Navy SEALs? Guys, they're all awesome.
Yeah. Right.
That like and often they work together, and when they
Yep.
work together, they're even more powerful But I think as per the operator, yeah, they're wildly intelligent. I was shocked by the number of college degrees. In fact, as a troop commander, the most senior guy, I think something like five of my guys had degrees, and I only had a bachelor's at the time.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
highly educated force.
Right. And well, you also, with the direct enlistment, you attract people who otherwise might not be interested in the military sometimes. And I remember in my special forces qualification course, we had a lot of college graduates, and
Hmm.
they didn't want to be officers right away. They wanted to be Green Berets first. And the Army was lucky to get them, and it might not have got them any other way.
Yeah, funny story. I remember I was interviewing General Jerry Boykin, and
Uh-huh.
he talked about shortly after the war the creation of the X-ray program. And I guess there was a lot of angst. Again, hey, we can't take people without experience in the army. And one of the sergeant majors, the oldest one in the room, said, "I was a special forces baby from Vietnam. I went direct from boot camp and infantry school direct to a special forces group,
I
and it
was
said,
too. We didn't call it 18 X-ray, but it was direct enlistment. And period,
"Yep."
sometimes they take it away for a while. And there's advantages to being in the Army for 3 years, particularly if you're in the Rangers or something. But on the other hand, no matter how raw that rookie is, if you select them right, once through qualification and everything, then add 2 more years on it. By the end of 3 years, you got a pretty darn good operator.
Especially with no established habits,
Yeah,
if you're
with
laying the
no
right
established
foundation.
habits. That's right.
Exactly.
And
You
that's what
you
I
you
found.
you bring up the 75th Ranger Regiment. When people ask me what unit impressed the hell out of you, they were a completely different I mean, every unit was a different unit by the end of the Global War on Terror, but the 75th had completely
Yep.
just morphed. I
Yeah.
called them the guerrilla force, and if the
Yeah.
75th is landing in a bunch of helicopters, run,
You're
run.
right. Right.
Uh,
Right.
so, I do want to, I want to transition to your personal life, but first, today's challenges. This is a VUCA environment for the American public: volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. China is being painted as our enemy. Uh, do you think that is fair? Do you think they're just a near peer military competitor, an economic competitor, or are we getting the narrative wrong here, or are they an enemy of the state?
Well, I think it's both in the sense that they want to be number one in the international system, and they're very realistic about it, meaning that they know the system ultimately depends on relative power,
Hmm.
and they can imagine where you might have a conflict to sort that out. Where we sure hope that doesn't happen. But because of nuclear weapons and because of the cost of a war between superpowers, we didn't have a direct conflict in the Cold War. We came close a couple times, but we didn't.
Hmm.
And so it's not inevitable with China, and we will trade with them. And what's different between this competition and the previous one is we will still, we may not give them our highest end high tech, but we will trade with them. And so the country that is likely on top in 2050 or so will be the one that wins the economic and technological competition. It's the
Yes.
most powerful country on earth across the board, not just in one area. And so we have to keep our guard up. But I don't. I think the main effort, even if we deter conflict, that doesn't mean we win this competition. We've got to win it as a society, and that's the essence of it. So I think I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but it isn't like we're destined for war and war will solve everything. It's a competition between two competing systems, and we've got to prevail in that. And then, unfortunately, if attacked, we got to be able to defend ourselves and
Yes.
our allies.
No. First off, that's a great answer. I think that provides a lot of context for people to help frame, despite what they're hearing in the media. Do you think our military is better equipped, having fought in the last 20 years in the global war on terror, for the next asymmetric challenges that we may face?
Um, well, we certainly have way more combat experience than anyone else, and so that's a big advantage. To deter China, it's like you need a military that has nuclear weapons to special operators and lots of other. You need Marines, you need sailors, etc. And so, to deter China, things like our space capabilities. We now have a space force, cyber. We're dominant in undersea warfare. We want to retain that. We've got already good global strike capabilities, but we want to build them up. And then there's this competition for influence that soft can play a big role in all around the world. And so you need all those things, and they don't necessarily all come out of combat. Some are new things. Um, but having that combat experience across the forces definitely is a big asset.
The way you phrase it, I smile, not to make light of the situation, but it's almost like, okay, yeah, this is basically a competition with China, especially on the fronts that you described: the technology, space, economic. So we need to be more innovative. We need to be faster. We need to be
Right,
better, and
right.
view it as an opportunity. But you you bring up special operations and their role moving forward. Yes, traditionally after wars, the military downsizes. I think SOF has proven that within small teams, they can have a dramatic or impactful effects on the battlefield, even if it's training our host nations. Do you think they'll downsize our U.S. special operations anytime soon, or do you think it's here to stay? And do you think they'll maintain probably one of the most arduous deployment sort of cadences of all the forces?
Yeah, so I don't, yes, compared to other forces, but compared to SOF the last 20 years, I don't think the deployment will be quite as bad when, everything we had was going into Afghanistan, Iraq, and then Al Qaeda elsewhere beyond those two countries. Um, so the deployment tempo will still be high, but not and high compared to conventional forces, but
Hmm.
not necessarily as high as our special operators had the last 2 decades. And it's important, um, to have, I would say, a combination in a way of deployments and things that we did to counter influence in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere, but also to do that training you need for high end conflict. One of the reasons I would say you want to maintain a pretty robust special operations force is one, global influence, but two, if you have to work with uh, an invaded country, a resistance, kind of a porcupine defense. Think
Hmm.
Taiwan, think the Baltic states, even Ukraine. Special operators, unless it's a very technical area like big air defense systems or others, they're what you want there, before and during the conflict. And then, this problem we face with China, where it holds our bases, our surface ships at risk, this anti access aerial denial capability. If you're going to insert ground forces, special operators, particularly SEALs, are likely to be the first thing you reach for, because they can operate in very small groups and get big effects and survive in that environment. So there's a lot of utility across mission sets, even in
Yes.
this great power competition and potentially conflict, that I think that makes um, special operations forces, you know, a force multiplying asset, and one you want to be really careful with about reducing too much.
So again, before we get into your personal life, this question had come in, and I this is pretty funny. Did we overestimate the capability of the Russian military, given what's going on in the Ukraine? That
Oh,
just
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, no question. This talk about they were going to win in 5 days, and they were formidable. There's no question it was overestimated.
did you think it was going to be this bad, logistically, tactically, strategically?
No, I have to confess, I'm glad it's this bad.
Of course.
But I'm a bit surprised too. I'll tell you a story. When I was a special operator, first part of my special forces 10 years, first half enlisted, and then officer. I did counterterrorism in Central America and other stuff. But preparing for World War III, I thought the Soviets were 10 feet tall. I mean, how we
Yeah.
would survive in Eastern Europe, seemed very daunting. Getting in was a challenge because of the air defenses, and then they've crushed resistances, and they'd have us all surrounded, and so it seemed like a daunting problem. When I saw him up close in Afghanistan, uh, supporting the Afghan resistance and had agents telling me things and others, I thought these guys are weaker than we think. They're a bear, and if you wake up all that firepower, you don't want to be on the wrong end of it. But they're a conscript army. They had drug problems. They had all kinds of things that allowed the Afghan resistance to ambush them. So when I saw, for instance, tanks charging forward, not supported by infantry, I thought this reminds me of Afghanistan. No wonder they're getting clobbered.
It's hey, that's the power of propaganda, and
Yeah,
hopefully every other nation thinks we're 10 feet tall. So
right.
Mike, again, for a lot of the viewers, they don't understand the high level of stress, risk, and sacrifice amongst our intelligence community members. I mean, leaders are looking for you for the final decision to say, Mike, what should we do here? How did you manage throughout your long career, sort of the personal and psychological toll and the cadence at which you had to work? I'm sure you were working 20-hour days. and managing 4 hours of sleep. How did you manage that for so long? And what lessons did you learn along the way that you may sort of extend to a younger man like myself?
Well, uh, it was different things at different stages. So, as a special operator and as a CIA operator, it was that 24/7 and being gone 10 months of the year and everything else. And a lot of stress because of um, uh, some counterterrorism operations. If you have an airline hijacking or something, hostages could die, and it's very intense period over 3 days, say, or something. Different experience, but with Afghanistan against the Soviets or Grenada, where it's a much bigger operation, then
Mhm.
lots of things can go wrong. Unfortunately, it happens in war, and you bear the responsibility of, did I plan correctly? Did I rehearse correctly? A lot of the burdens of command. And then as a senior official, same thing. Um, Convincing our political leadership, when you're the senior expert, that this is the right thing to do, and they trust you. This raid can succeed. Bin Laden raid, for example. This is the right way to do it, and we can do this. Um you bear a lot of stress and responsibility for that. That president or others is relying on your judgment for this, and operators, I'm no longer an operator at that point, but those who are going to go do it, you hope you made the right decision there too, or convinced our very top leaders, to make that decision. So different kinds of stress at different periods. But, um, given the nature of the uh, global fight against the jihadists, I was in one theater or another probably a third of the time, and then in Washington fighting those battles, and et cetera. So it was pretty nonstop, but
That's
nothing like being an operator. So I don't, it's just a different kind of stress.
I beg to differ.
Yeah.
I gotta, I hate to say this. I don't want to say we were having fun, but we were also surrounded by 40 of our brothers, if not
Yes.
more, 12 of our brothers,
Right.
and you had a sense of purpose.
Yes.
What's the phrase from that movie? Best job I ever had, no matter how
Yeah.
much it sucked.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
I don't envy you in that fight that you had to fight, but it's good to know that we've got good men up on the hill, fighting not only the external fight, and I don't want to say the internal fight, but also dealing with the internal politics, which is just a reality of life. Ultimately, to make the right decision, and which impacts our guys on the front lines. Mike, we close this out with a question where we believe the greatest thing, and you've done. Congrats on the book again. For those that are listening, it's by all means available. I'm sorry, by all means available. Memoirs of a life in intelligence, special operations, and strategy. And I recommend you pick this up, especially for those that are maybe political science students. Uh, you know, uh, let's say students of war, students of leadership. Pick this thing up because Mike has definitely sort of shown vulnerability to write about his life, lessons learned, successes, and failures alike. What do you consider the sort of three keys to success or things that you've learned along your way that you would bestow again on someone like me or the younger generation to set them up for success?
Yeah. So one is, you want to do what you love ideally, but unfortunately, you may not be good at what you love, and so you've got to be, um, you've got to find that thing that you can both be passionate about and be good at. And work hard at it. Sometimes, no matter how good you are when you start, it just takes hard work to develop a consummate special operator or CIA officer, and then I would say policymaker. No matter how smart you are, if you don't have the right experiences, you're going to be challenged. And so there's that. Um, and then it's sort of standard advice, but you really, I believe in two things. Early on, that kind of attracted me to special operations in the first place, even though I didn't know what to call it. And uh, There were these different. When I was a young soldier in the army, we taught a lot of leadership and different theories of leadership and motivating, and some of them, which applied more to special operators, really devolved around expertise. Were you really, really good at something? But also, were you the kind of leader that people wanted to follow, even if you didn't have the designated position? Would they pick you over someone else? Would they pick you to be your leader, even their leader, even though you're not necessarily the most senior guy? And aspiring to that or developing those qualities, I think I found it helpful in my career, and then broadening as you go on, as you're ready to take on broader responsibilities. So being really good at some things, and learning more and more, but then broadening. And so that's what I did later in my career, as I transitioned from operator to policymaker. Adding things like space and cyber made me more effective across the board in the Pentagon, not just in the stuff that I grew up with. And so there's an appropriate time to broaden too, I would say. And then just don't warm the seat. Fortune favors the bold. So if you get an opportunity, seize it. Another thing I learned in the course of my career, a fellow I had served with in the late Bush administration, although he was senior to me. He was Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, and he had a career at Goldman Sachs. And he said one of the keys to his success was not just doing his job well, but job enlargement, taking on more responsibilities. And, you got to be careful with that you don't look like you've got really sharp elbows. But that is how you develop great leaders who can lead organizations, is you give them more and you give them more and they seek out more. And I was fortunate at stages of my career that I had mentors who, did that with me, Afghanistan and some others.
And many would say the same about you and the mentorship you've given. So I appreciate those 5 rules. We definitely sort of again memorialize those and push those out for the audience to learn. Um, Mike, is there anything else you want the audience to know? Again, your book, which came out today,
Comes
um,
out today. Yep.
it
It's
comes
out.
out
Yeah.
today. Again, by all means available. You can find it on Amazon. I've already checked; it's up. Please look it up. Anything else where people can find you and maybe contact you to come in and speak?
That's great. Well, they can certainly get me through you, um, um, and my publicist at Knopf, and happy to talk to the right groups. Absolutely.
Okay. Mike, again, thank you for your service, your long service. It is a thrill to have you on, especially knowing who you were as a young special operator for a very long time. So
Uh,
I'm glad that things circled around and we finally got to connect.
yeah, it's a joy to be with you, Mike. Yeah, absolutely. Kindred spirits.
Likewise. And for everyone, this has been the Mentional Everyday Warrior. Remember, go leave a review on Apple Podcast, on Google Cast, whatever your platform is. Leave a review. We read all of them. That's how we get better. No matter how critical it may be, that's the mechanism we use to not only select guests, but to improve our show. So again, thanks for listening.